Oh, hello, world. Don't worry, I'm here. It's me, your old pal, Dan Shaheen. Welcome to Comic Book News. Oh, yeah, the logo. Today, man, what an exciting show. Been waiting for this one for a really long time. This is the return of somebody who appeared on one of my very first live streams, the publisher Steve Jeppy panel that I had way back when. I kind of kicked this whole channel off into life. But let me just say that I feel like today's guest is, I don't know, I'm going to say he's one of, if not the most successful independent comic book publishers of all time. He's produced some of my very favorite comics from some of my very favorite creators. I think part of the success of today's guest, Mike Richardson from Dark Horse Comics, is that he respected creator rights above all else. That was one of the tenets of his company, and that let him attract the brightest talents in the comic book industry. And now, apart from that, and a nice mixture of high-quality licensed products from Hollywood, like the Aliens comics, Star Wars, etc., that blend became almost the template for the modern indie comics publisher. A little mix of a company owned, a little creator owned, and some licensed stuff. Some mix of that is present in almost all the independent, at least the successful independent publishers that we see today. So we're going to talk to Mike about that. We're going to talk about how he went from, man, he's touched so many parts of the industry you might not even be aware of, besides being the publisher, besides being a creator, artist, and writer himself. He's been a professional in marketing, as well as owning Tales from Another World, a really interesting retail shop focusing on pop culture stuff, including comics. We're going to talk to our guest about that and much more. But before we do, what are we going to do? We got to go somewhere. Where are we going to go? We'll take it somewhere else. Let's take it into the Bat Cave today, and we will talk with none other. Well, let's bring it into the Bat Cave, and let's talk to Mike Richardson. Hey, Mike, welcome to Comic Book News.
Hello. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, thanks for making the time. I know you're a busy guy because you got irons in the fire, whether it be comic books, publishing, movies, television, or just managing your amazing business, which was just recently purchased by a larger conglomerate, I guess. So you're a busy dude. I really appreciate you taking the time to come in here. And I think where we want to start is how does it begin for Mike Richardson? What is your first memory of reading comics?
Oh, well, I always read comics. My mom was young. She bought comics. She was a comic fan as a kid, so they were always around the house. And I used to pick them up when I was very young, 4 years old, I think, probably, maybe before that. But they were always around the house, and I wanted to know what was inside those books that had all those great pictures. So as a result, my mom taught me to read. I could read when I went into school, which I think is a great advantage for anyone, for any child, to be able to already be good at reading. In fact, I did an interview one time where they asked me how I was at school, and I said, well, I was bored pretty much the whole time. And they said, well, when did your boredom start? And I said, well, the first day of the first grade, first hour, they passed out a book called Fun with Dick and Jane, which used to be the primary reader for everyone. And I read it while they passed it out. And so I think immediately after that is where my boredom started.
Yeah. That's amazing. I remember myself in school, they had testing to get into advanced placement and things, and they did a vocabulary test. And I knew words like nefarious,
Right.
and words that just there's the only one place I picked those up for sure, right? Straight out
Sure.
of comics.
Sure. I
Um,
know exactly what you're saying.
so what are the comics that really turned you on as a kid? Like what style of comics were you into? Superheroes?
Oh, well, when I was a kid, I'd read everything. I mean, I even, by the time I had my first bicycle, I was writing to stores because I knew which store had which comic. So you could go to the Milwaukee Pharmacy, and it had Marvels, and you had uh, Perry's Rexall, which had a weird mix of Archies and DCs, and you rode out a mile out McLaughlin to the Fudo Mart because they had the Archie superheroes like the Fly and Jaguar. You went out 32nd, and that's where I found my first issue of Thor and the first issue of Fantastic Four and Spider-Man. So, and there was even a meat market. Bud Cooper's Meat Market had a spin rack, and in that you got the Atlas comics, and you might get in Charlton. It also had Charlton mixed in there, so you might get an Atomic Mouse, but you might get a Steve Ditko Captain Atom, which were beautifully illustrated books.
Mhm. How do you compare that world that you grew up in? And you were born in 1950, I think, right?
Uh-huh.
And so how do you compare that world of comics access, let's say, to where we're at in 2021?
Well, I believe we have turned a corner, but I have to say, when I was growing up, there were comics everywhere. Like I say, they were in the meat market. You go to a bus station or a train station, and they're the biggest racks of comics you ever saw. Every variety store, everywhere. Comics were everywhere around us, and they were in places you wouldn't expect. I mean, I went to Catholic school, and there was Treasure Chest, which was a comic, and had some interesting artists I didn't know at the
Yeah.
time, but like Alex Toth, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
And you had the Air Force had a comic, a promotional comic they gave away every year. And I mean, I knew all of these things. I was a big comic fan, and I had a huge collection. When I was in high school, a friend of mine came over to my house when I wasn't around and told my brother that he was supposed to take all my comics. So my brother helped him load them all up into a truck, and they drove away. And those are the comics I collected since, like I said, I was 4 years old, and boxes and boxes, and that sort of killed my enthusiasm for comics for a while. But
Oh no! How did you not kill that guy?
well, we're still friends, believe it or not. But his mom threw them out because they were comics. When I went to get them back, she threw them out because they were comics.
Oh, dude,
But
that's a friendship dissolver right there. I'm
yeah,
sorry.
well, we got past it, I guess. But I didn't read comics, but I was an art major in school, and of course, the influence of fantasy artists and comic artists was still there. When my mom used to buy me the Ace F series Burroughs books, if you know what those are.
Mm-mm.
They had covers by Roy Krinkle and Frank Frazetta, and the Frazetta art I love so much, and it was just this mysterious signature that said Frazetta on the cover.
Yeah.
So I read all those and very aware of who he was as an artist. I didn't know anything about him personally because we didn't have internet in those days. He was just this mysterious guy that we all liked. And while I was in college, I was walking through. There used to be a chain of stores called J.K. Gill, and I was walking through, and they used to have the latest paperbacks, a term that I don't even know if you use anymore, but pocketbooks, paperbacks, whatever you call them. Anyway, the across the I don't know, I was probably halfway across the floor, and I spotted a cover, and it just drew me to it, and I picked it up, and it looked like Tarzan, but it said Conan. He was on the back of an ape. It was the Rogues in the House issue, and it said Frazetta underneath. So I started picking up all those books and started looking for more Frazetta at the time. And in fact, I was so infatuated with Frazetta that, like I said, I was an art major, and my last painting, the one we were supposed to do, that was to show everything that we could do as an artist. And my art teacher, his name was Mel Katz, walked over and saw what I was painting and took it off the stand and said, Frazetta did that a long time ago. So, so I had to take a completely different approach. But anyway, um, then my brother knew I was reading these Conan things and brought me this Conan #1 comic, and that started everything again, because I saw Barry Windsor Smith's art. He was just Barry Smith at the time, but Barry Windsor Smith he became later, and that started me picking that book up. But I saw his development issue by issue. You could see tremendous leaps he was making in his art. And of course, I recognized some of his influences, the Romanicists and the Art Nouveau with Mucha and some of those elements, which I was really into at the time. And so I just started picking comics up again. Starlin's was coming was being recognized at the time. Bernie Wrightson, all of these people that I started becoming aware of, and it got me back into the comic book business.
What's interesting to me is, and maybe it's just your era, your vintage, if you will, but like when you're talking about the comics that you came up on, it was it seems like you were really attracted to the medium of comics, not just like one specific genre. Like something about it appealed. Did you kind of grok what that was then, or did that come later?
No, I was looking for stories that interested me, but it was the art at the same time. So I liked to write stories back then. The Mask is a character that I was playing around with years before.
Wow.
So there's just a recognition of and attraction to words and pictures in that combination in comics. And again, probably because I was looking at them when I was 3 and 4 years old. You know, they say your brain starts solidifying at a very young age. And so something about comics attracted me then. And so that stayed with me my whole life. When I always planned to start my own business, and when I was trying to think of what I wanted to do, my wife sent me a teddy bear at work one day, and it said, "You're a dad." And I did whatever every new father does. I went and quit my job on the spot, and I had a great job. I mean, they tried to keep me there. I was designing products and doing art for a company called D&M Wood Products, which was, they were very good to me. But, Bill Goodman was my boss at that place, and he had treated me very well, but they wanted me to come back. But if I was going to start having kids, I wanted to get my business going. And so what I did is, my wife was the assistant to the president of First State Bank AmeriCard, and she had been there for quite a while, never missed a day of work. And I told her to quit her job, and I had quit mine, and we were going to move to Bend, Oregon, which is 100 and some miles away, where we didn't know anybody. And I was going to start a comic book shop, because I had this illusion that I could sit in the back when customers weren't in there. By the way, I had no business classes. I learned the right way, I guess, by doing it. But I sat in the back of this. My dream was to sit in the back and illustrate my own book, children's book. That's what I started out doing. But of course, that was a ridiculous idea, because you're busy with the store all the time. And
don't I know it, Mike? Don't I know it?
Yeah, went from one retail store, and it started out as Pegasus Fantasy Books. And I had applied for a number of names that people had. For instance, Wonderworks, I thought was my original name for the retail store. Somebody had it. And then I applied for another name. Somebody had it. So I put 20 names. The last name on that thing was Pegasus Fantasy Books. And of course, the state, my DBA, they picked that one, the very last one I could think of to fill out 20, because I needed them to pick one. So it was good. It had a good image. We had Pegasus image all over everything.
What year was that?
I opened the store on January 1st, 1980. And that summer,
very early direct market store.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And I moved, we moved, like I say, I moved ahead of my wife. She stayed in Portland until she had our first daughter. And I a friend of mine moved down there at the same time. We started talking, and we built a couple houses together. He started his business, and the two of us put a couple of houses together. I always remember the first one we did off a plan that we bought, and he was the builder. I was the nail pounder, and the guy that climbed up high when he needed that. But there was a slight. I'm looking at my image there. A slight, very slight grade down, and the garage came out from the house in the plan we had. But by the time we got it out to the end, when we actually framed it, it was about 30 feet high. So that's what happens when you don't really know what you're doing. I don't want to say this about my friend who was the builder, because he definitely knew how to build, but we turned that into a positive. We added another room upstairs and over the garage. So you turn a lemon into lemonade, right?
Sure. Well, I mean, so you were designing wood products, then you're pounding nails in wood, and then you decided to turn to another wood product, pulp wood, and move these things.
Yeah. Well, the working on the how construction, whatever you want to call it, building houses. That was just, he was starting that business, and I worked there. And that night we would go over and we'd work on my store. I bought a little, or rented leased a little 400 square foot space that was going to be the retail store. And we made it very nice inside. So we'd work during the day on his project, and then we'd come over and work on mine at night. And didn't make his wife very happy, but
how was the Bend comic scene in that era? Like, did you
none.
have enough business to stay in business?
Oh yeah. The interesting thing is, I always throughout business, I always think if I like it, there's got to be other people that like it. I'm not going to be some lone voice or the only one interested in something. So I thought there'd be other people, but the surprising thing is, by the way, I forget the cents. I think it's our first day of sales was $8.67, and my wife, with our new baby, told her mom, and her mom wanted her to move back home immediately because she thought this was going to be a disaster. My friends actually practiced, by the way, and they hate me telling the story, but they practiced an intervention. So because I had quit this great job and gone down to Bend to start a comic book shop in this little tiny space, so they said they're coming down to see me, and the girls all took my wife out, and the guys took me out. They said they had to stop by one of their hotel rooms first. So we went in, and they sat me down. Then they started pounding on me to forget this craziness and go back and get my job, move back to Portland. And this went on for at least an hour. And finally I said, "You're right, I'm going to do it." I had no intention of doing it, but I wanted to go out and drink beer. That was supposed to be the original intent. But they had this plan to help me fix my life and put it back in order.
Man.
But
And if that had succeeded, they would have no idea. Yeah, that's the funny thing. You just would have been Mike Richardson, the design guy somewhere, and then none of the amazing stuff that came out of Dark Horse would have.
Yeah, it would have never. There was no way that I was going to change or change I wanted to own my own business, and I wanted to do something that I like to do. My fear was getting stuck in a job where you're looking at, and I say this to a lot of my employees that I've talked to, who feel unhappy, where they're at. I said, don't be somewhere where you spend most of your waking hours looking at a clock and wishing you were somewhere else. I wasn't going to do that. I was going to do something I liked. Money was never the object for me. Obviously, we all like to have money, and obviously I wanted to be successful financially, but that wasn't the driving force. The driving force for me to do something I really enjoyed doing and spend my life doing that.
Mike, I just see all these parallels to myself when I quit I didn't have kids, but I quit a pretty good paying job to start a comic book store in San Jose, or the one that I grew up working in. I started working in when I was 11. So I really resonate. What you're saying resonates with me quite a bit.
I think a lot of comic shop owners are the same way. They all love dealing with comics, and maybe they can't be a professional inside the business, but they certainly can be a professional in the business, selling comics and being near to something they really enjoy.
Okay, and certainly in this day and age, it's tougher than ever to be a retailer of any kind,
Right.
let alone a comic book retailer. And back then, I don't think it was that much easier, right? From what you're describing, $8. That's although $8.60 or whatever is like double minimum wage, at least an hour minimum wage back then.
Yeah, I think when my first job while I was in college, I was making $4 an hour.
Yeah.
And I demanded a raise, so I went up to 405, you know. So but of course money was worth it. Money was worth
$2 an hour in store credit at the comic book store when I was 11. Yeah. I feel it. Yeah. But what made the shift? When did you decide, and I'm assuming it was during that period, that you wanted to pursue publishing comics as opposed to just like retailing them?
Well, look, I had ambitions to grow the chain, maybe franchise it sometime. So that was one of my original ideas. But I started having writers and artists down in Bend telling me the same story, that they create these amazing properties and they'd sign the back of their check and they'd lose all rights to it, which offended me as an artist. And I just started thinking there's got to be a better deal for creators. And I thought, you know, not only is it an ethical approach, it's also a good business approach, because why wouldn't creators, if creators had an option to own their property as opposed to give it away forever, it seemed to me, for me, I would want that option. As I said, I've always sort of traveled down the road where if I feel some way, I'm sure other people feel, there are a number of other people that feel the same way. So I just thought that somebody needed to start a company where the creators were in control of their property, the properties they create. And that's what put the idea in my head, is talking to those creators. They'd come down to Bend, we'd fly them in, we'd go to dinner.
And who's an example? Who's like the, who would those folks have been?
Geez, way back then, Ron Wilson came to my store. What's his name? Mitchell, who was the inker on Iron Man. I heard the story of Barry Smith, who, as I said, was one of the reasons I got back into comics, that he signed the back of his check, and I believe it was him that talked about losing rights to his work. It was just, and at the same time, the whole Jack Kirby art situation was rising. In fact, when one of our first books was Boris the Bear, and we went after all those comic book ills in that Boris the Bear. Boris was out to solve everything, you know. And
one of my favorites.
Yeah, we could sit on the outside and take pot shots because we were not really, you know, look, we were a new comic company and we weren't part of the establishment, and so we did take pot shots on different things that came up in the comic book industry.
Did at that moment, I'm not sure exactly what year we're in, but did Pacific Comics exist, and did you draw inspiration from Bill Shannis and his creator-owned publishing schemes?
No, because I already had the thought in my head. I mean, the first direct sales book was a Marvel book, and it was the direct sales, for people who don't know, is the group of non-returnable retailers who specialize in comics. And there used to be 19 comic book distributors that serviced the direct sales market, and now we're down to one, which is Diamond and Steve Jeffries' company. And I think at the time that competition was good for the market. I think Diamond's been a good partner for us all these years, so I'm not saying anything against them, but it's always good to have competition. If you're the one who has to choose which company you're going to work with, it puts you in a good position if you can find the best deal you can instead of the deal that's offered to you. So that was a healthy market, but as we know, during the 90s, that market pretty much collapsed.
Yeah, we talk a lot about that on this channel. I've had Steve Jeppy in. We went over point by point the whole collapse, the Heroes World implosion, the DC's option to buy Diamond, and all that good stuff.
Right.
Which
Well,
was
Steve's a
fascinating time. I think I'm going to work on a documentary about that specific
right.
period of time.
Well, Steve's a lot like I am. We've always had sort of a shared experience because he started out with a comic shop. He was a mailman, as you might know, and
Yeah.
the legend is he saw someone throwing out a box of comics and he asked if he could have them, and then started buying comics up and down the East Coast and became not just a retailer but the biggest distributor in comics over his career. So again, someone else who is passionate about comics and um, a good friend of mine, and I've watched him grow his company as I've grown mine.
I like to refer to that age of diamond exclusivity as the diamond age of comics, because it really defined a whole set of business practices and everything that came out of that wild event. Okay, let's get out of distribution wars a little bit. I want to get into creators. I want to get into license deals. I want to get into what your strategy when you started Dark Horse and how that might have evolved into what we see today. Because as I remember, for me, I mean, there was Boris the Bear and a couple other things. I loved Dark Horse Presents. Concrete is an all-time ultimate favorite of mine. But it felt at the time, I was working at a comic book shop in 86. I started in 86. And it seemed to me the first really big thing that hit from Dark Horse that really captured a lot of people's attention, and you can change my mind on this, was the Aliens license and those comics, which not only were really great comics, they sort of elevated, in my mind, and I think in the industry's eyes, what a licensed book could be like and what you could do with that. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, as I was saying earlier, the original impetus to the company was to preserve creator rights. So when I decided to start the company, I called a friend of mine who was working for the LA Times and a member of something called APA 5. APA 5 was remember this before the internet. So APA 5 was a way for potential artists and writers who wanted to be in the comic book industry to sort of sharpen their skills and put their art in. For instance, I had the Mask in there, early versions of the Mask.
Oh, wow.
Frank Miller was an APA 5 member. Mark Badger, Randy Stradley. That's how I met Randy.
I think Scott McCloud maybe too, and I know there were a bunch of APAs at that time that people were contributing to, right?
Well, Mark Verheiden started the first comic APA, and it was the only comic APA I knew. But APA 5 was the one that Mark Verheiden started, and Mark and I became good friends over time. But a lot of those people, there's a whole number of people that went on to professional careers out of APA 5, and that's where, when I decided to start the company, after I really decided to take the plunge into publishing, I contacted Randy Stradley, who was working at the LA Times, and I said, I'm going to start a comics company. You want to come up and started with me, and of course he came up. And so then the first people that we approached were all APA 5 people, the ones we thought were the most talented. Randy himself was a terrific writer. He and I created a lot of the characters in the early days and wrote a lot of the books in the very earliest days, till the company actually became a real company. I mean, initially it was fun. We stood in the store, we wrote books and out of our Beaverton store and pasted them up on the counter out there. But we grew faster than we could have ever anticipated. So some of those people that we contacted, Randy Emberlin, of course, Paul Chadwick, who was a crucial person in our development as a company. Paul's book was very successful he was winning awards, and immediately there were 5 companies that thought they could take him away. And Paul stuck with us, and I'll always.
And he was doing work with Marvel at the time. I remember he was drawing Dazzler and some other stuff.
The first direct sales comic. Yeah, he drew that, and doing some other stuff. But he was a tremendously talented artist. He did Concrete, big success for us at the time. And by a big success for us at the time was to sell 20 to 30,000, except for Boris the Bear. Boris the Bear was, well, our first book was Dark Horse Presents. In the first issue, we hoped to sell 10,000 copies. That was our dream, to break even. We sold 50, and then we went into a second printing, so we sold another 5 or 10. Boris the Bear came out right after, same month, right after, and it sold 80 plus thousand. So we had no overhead. We were doing this on the counter of my Beaverton store, and when you're printing that many books, it's like every book was a dollar bill over 10,000. I mean, so
because as your print run goes up, your unit cost goes down, right?
Yeah, that's correct. And when you're getting up into those numbers, particularly at that time, those are big numbers for us. And
those are big numbers today, Mike. Those are big numbers for a comic book in 2022.
Yeah, that's correct. But you know, we were part of this black and white boom, and what people don't remember, and in September of '87, we had Black September, or whatever we used to call it. It's where 100 of these black and white comic companies went out of business all at once. I don't know if you remember this. And we were one of the ones that survived. A lot of them had tried to cash in on the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle craze, which, you know, took off that first issue. I remember as a retailer, look, I bought that issue. I bought a bunch of them because people may not know that now. It was sort of a spoof of Miller's Elektra.
Totally.
And you saw it, and the name was so crazy that you just bought a bunch of them when you had all of these books to pick out of. And we took a different tack, though. It was such a big... I walked down to Richard Finn's Second Genesis, who was the distributor, and I saw there was 8 or 9 what we called adjective noun books: preteen, dirty jean, kung fu kangaroos, and
adolescent radioactive black belt hamsters.
The hamsters, yeah. And there was Miami mice, goofy Miami, all of these things. And I said to Richard, I wish somebody come along and create a character that got rid of all these books. And driving back, I started thinking of that to the retail store out of Beaverton. I walked in and said, Randy, I got this idea. We have to do this book. And we started looking around. I mean, we tried to get a hold of Keith Giffen, who was doing Ambush Bug at the time, and some other professionals. And then I just thought, let's use somebody from APA 5. And Jim Smith was a APA 5 artist, and he was drawing this little bear that he called Boris. And I pitched him the idea. We set him up in an apartment and set him up to start doing comics after the first issue, because originally it was going to be a one-shot, but it sold 80,000 plus comics or copies.
Did you think the Turtles fueled the speculation boom that helped that book in particular?
I think that, yeah, there was speculation going on a lot of the black and whites at the time, unfortunately.
Kind of at the shop level as well as at the...
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And I think that so many people copied it. A lot of people had success in the, you know, they were flying in the draft of the Turtles, you know, it was carrying a lot of comics. Well, we did something different. We slaughtered all those characters in a single issue. And Boris knew he was in a comic, and he was running out of pages. He used to come into my Beaverton store to see his whole, the whole plot was he wanted more room on the stand for his own comic. So he decided to get rid of the other characters, running out of pages. So he put a free beer sign for comic characters, and then went in with an Uzi. And that
I think we need to bring Boris back to clear some room on the shelves right now, Mike.
Well, Jim and I are days, but I'd be happy to do that. But Jim's off doing his own thing.
Well, we're in this era though now where, you know, it used to be the nice boutique. It was Marvel, DC. Along came Dark Horse. Here's Dark Horse. Here's maybe Image. Okay, everybody's in the comic zone. We all know each other. Now we're in a world where those creators who cut their teeth in that era are getting approached by Abrams Books, and I can't even think of any of the other big New York publishing houses, but they all have comics imprints at this point.
Yeah, it's interesting. We talked about partnering with some of those publishers, the actual publishing side of those companies, and none of those partnerships lasted, but just because they didn't have the same approach to creator rights that we did. So we'd end up stalemating a lot. So we stopped trying to do that. We have, of course, made a terrific deal with Random House, Penguin Random House now, for distribution, and they've done a tremendous job for us. The efficiencies there in the book market are amazing, and they're great people. We're in the publisher services division. Jeff Abram is the president of that. He gets our business really well, and when we moved to Random House, our sales went up 40% in the first month.
Wow.
For our books, yeah.
I think that speaks a lot to the breadth as well as the depth of Star Wars.
Excuse me just a minute. Yeah. Bye, Sal. Sorry, that's my daughter.
I think that speaks well to the breadth and depth of the Dark Horse back catalog. Because you guys, this is, again, I'm going to come back to this. Dark Horse has put out some superhero comics. Okay, you even put out a superhero universe,
and it'll come back in the future too.
Well, and they might, and you might again, right? You don't rule anything.
No, we will again. I'm telling you right now, it's coming back again.
Okay, same universe or
same universe with some new characters added.
So we're gonna the return of what, X?
But we don't try. Yeah, X and Ghost and Captain Midnight and some of those characters. We don't try to compete with Marvel or DC. So that's something we've created some interesting characters. Some of them did very well, like X and Ghost, and so we want to keep those characters as the backlist still sells. So we'll go back and visit it.
But if you were to look at Dark Horse's total output and make a pie graph, superheroes is not, I mean, Marvel DC is 98%, right? And there's a little bit of like sprinkling of other stuff. Dark Horse,
but I never wanted to compete with Marvel and DC.
Well, you did though. I mean, you did in the sense that, and even there's been a direct competition. We could talk a little bit about the Star Wars license if you want. I hope that's not a sore subject or anything.
Well, it's not sore at all. We're doing Star Wars comics again.
Oh, right.
Do you know that?
I guess I didn't know that, or I read an announcement, but I don't think I've seen it. I don't think I've seen it.
We're working on the first series, and we're plotting it out and working with the people at Lucas, and we're back in. And take us a little while to build up a line, but we're there.
Great. I mean, you guys were like the original, not the original Star Wars licensee. No, that was Marvel, but licensee, whatever. You licensed stuff, and you did really well. We touched for a second on Aliens, and I really want to understand how the Aliens franchise landed at Dark Horse Comics, because I think that ties into this.
So movie comics were not a big deal in those days. Basically, what you'd see is comics that were put out to cash in on a movie success, and then they'd fade away. And generally, we're not particularly interesting. I mean,
they were either adaptations of the source material, or they were kind of a weak sauce, like
one-off per individual stories, issue by issue. That I always remembered one of the things that in the Star Wars comics, because obviously I was a big Star Wars fan. It came out when I was in high school, so I liked the original series quite a bit. It was quite groundbreaking at the time. And so they put out some comics, and I always remember there's certain comics that I said, okay, this is what you have to put in a book about how not to write comics. But the Enterprise puts Kirk, and as I remember it, Enterprise puts Kirk and Spock on this particular planet that have no emotions, because the emotions were gathered up and put into a jar. So they had to find this jar to let the emotions of this planet back out. And I thought, this is not how you write a story that has any kind of logic or sensibility to it. You can have fantasy. You can challenge your readers' uh, belief, and you can write fantastic, put fantastic elements in. But when you casually say that a planet's emotions have been stored in jars or something, you've lost me right there.
Right.
And there's a whole series. I'm not going to say the author, but there's another book that we used to laugh about, which was one of the books just before I decided to start publishing, where, and I'll get this wrong because I'm going off memory, but you have a spaceship shooting through space. I can't remember. It may have been going caught in a black hole or something. There's some emergency in there, and they call a meeting. Everybody, they're shooting through space. Disaster is all around them, but they all show up in their costumes at a meeting table because preserving their secret identities is a must, right? And as they're talking calmly, in comes the character known as Eros and announces, "From this day, I shall be known as Star Fox." Oh, Star Fox, huh? And again, I thought, okay, I got to get into publishing because this is making me crazy. Excuse me.
Okay. Whoa, that I think at that time too, adaptations, like it was in the era where comic books were deemed as, if not children's fare, then maybe subliterate adult fare. And also Paul Levitz brought up a really interesting thing about licensed comics that I think does not apply to Dark Horse. He was like, most of the time they get a license, you give it to someone and they don't have any stake in the long-term future of that product. So they don't put out their best work. They don't put their heart into it and make interesting creative choices. But I felt like you dodged that trap with many of the aliens, if not all of the Aliens and Predator series.
Well, I think we took a different approach. I'm not saying no one ever took it, but it wasn't evident in the industry as a general practice. But what really happened, what started it, is we had some critics were raving about some of our comics. This is a time where Marvel canceled comics that were under 100,000, and so we were outperforming the other so-called independents. I never knew what independent meant, except independent of Marvel and DC.
Right.
I'm not sure what that means because most of the independents are owned by corporations.
True.
So I don't know what it means. But anyway,
I think it had a lot more meaning back in those days.
I still didn't know what the only thing I could tell, because there was a variety of different types of companies that came in during that big explosion we came in at. But I always said when people say, what does independent mean? I said it means independent of Marvel and DC, because that's the only common link that all these companies have. But look, one of the thinking behind going to licensed comics was because we had some books that had really broken out as far as critics. Harlan Ellison on his radio show in LA used to rave about Concrete and Dark Horse Presents. I mean, he was calling me at the time, and Harlan was one of the writers that I respected, so I was flattered that he would call, and of course he wanted to get on our mailing list. Also, Harlan had a huge comic collection.
We're definitely coming back to Concrete in a minute for sure.
Right. So anyway, but it dawned, Randy and I are sitting there talking one day, and I said, the edge that Marvel and DC has is they have these characters. We're launching new characters all the time, and it takes a while to build up those audiences. And we're brand new. We've only been in business for a year and a half, I think, when the aliens subject came up. But Superman's been around at the time, I don't know, whatever it was, 30, 40 years. And same with Batman and all of those things, all of those titles. They've had Spider-Man early 60s. And so it seemed like that was a disadvantage. So we started talking about, well, wait a minute, what if we started licensing some books that have been around a long time? And movies are the obvious place. And people haven't really done movie comics very well. Doesn't mean, don't want anyone to take offense, doesn't mean there weren't some books that were done well, but
There's
generally.
probably a couple we could think of, but not
Yeah,
many.
yeah, not many, and they're just issue by issue. We decided to, so we were a huge Alien fan. Aliens had just come out. Sigourney Weaver was great. Literally the archetype for female
Yeah.
superheroes. Sigourney Weaver in that movie. So we decided, and if you notice in a lot of our movie comics, as a result, a lot of our heroes are female protagonists.
Yeah.
So we started thinking about aliens. Let's try aliens, and we sat down and started plotting what the sequel. This is what we did with all our comics back then. We'd sit down and say, what's the sequel we wanted to see? And the when we came up with aliens, we called Fox licensing in those days, because generally in those days product licensing hadn't been very studios weren't that interested in those days. It's amazing because I could call up and get a license. Fox had two people, Elevadia and Pam North was the licensing department. They were the two people, and they didn't have much. And
can you tell me, out of Scott, I hate to interrupt, can you tell me about what you paid for that license at that time?
Geez, I can't remember. We probably paid $10,000 with a guarantee of 100 at the time, but which was a lot of money for us to guarantee at that time. That was our first big license. But the book sold. We sat down. We brought Mark Verheiden up from LA, and we sat in the restaurant across the street, and we plotted out what the sequel to the movies were going to be. And I mean, we were into the movies, so it was great to. It was fun. It was fun for us to sit and plot the sequel, and it was going to be in print form. And it sold hundreds of thousands. I mean, that took us over the top. So the strategy was a good strategy. And so while we were doing that book, no sooner had that come out than I'm watching this TV trailer for a movie called Predator. And guess what? It's at Fox. So I call Al again and Pam North again and say, hey, you saw our successor. We want to do Predator. And they said, great, let's go for it, because they didn't have that many licenses going. So it was wide open.
That's awesome.
So then we wanted to approach DC. I had talked to Paul. By the way, Paul had written an article. Paul had written an article about the black and white boom, and made an offhand comment that something to the effect that they were a bunch of would-be publishers working out of their garage. Well, I was very offended. I wrote him a long letter basically saying, my people come in the morning, they go home at 5 o'clock. We have a company building. They get payroll checks, all the things. I went a list of all the things very facetiously. And Paul called me and apologized. And I told Paul then that when he was gone from when he finally came to his senses and left DC, he would be working for Dark Horse. So I just want to point out that Paul does his graphic novels with us right now. He's working on a new one right now. So just want to point that out. There's a number of people that I told that to. And,
I think anyone will, I mean, you don't even have to know Mike Richardson or know much about Dark Horse to look at the folks that you published who own their own rights, who are at the tippity top of the industry, who come back to you again and again. So that alone just says like, oh yeah, this is a place I at least have to seriously consider.
Okay. Yeah, we'll have an announcement about somebody very shortly. And I'm not going to say, I'm just going to tease you. There's somebody who left that's coming back. So that'll be an announcement coming up very shortly.
Awesome. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about.
But anyway, so the point is that we did these comics as sequels, and we followed up with Terminator and a whole series of them. It was good strategy. And before you knew it, not everyone, but many of the independent publishers were following that model. You mentioned before that a lot of the independents followed the Dark Horse model. There's literally someone well-known working at a publisher right now that I had lunch with one time in New York, and he said he took 3 years off, studied Dark Horse's model, put a presentation together, and went to the other publishers to say, this is how to build your company into a successful publishing entity. So evidently we were good enough that we created the model that this particular consultant was selling.
Amazing. I think putting quality at the forefront is really what it's about. And man, that your first Aliens versus Predator comic.
Well, we were trying to come up with something to do with DC. That's
okay.
Talking to Paul at the time, and so would you do something? He said, "Well, pitch us something." So we were working at coming up with something, and Chris Warner left the room while we were talking about who it could be with the characters we had and which one made sense. Chris came walking back in the room and said, "Wait a minute. Why even go anywhere else? Aliens and Predator are both at Fox. We can just call them and let's do Aliens versus Predator."
Yeah.
So I called Pam and I said, "Pam, we've got an idea, Aliens versus Predator." And she said, "King Kong versus Godzilla, rock and roll." And so that book sold a million copies. It sold huge numbers.
And it was great, Mark. It was better than any Aliens versus Predator movie ever made. It was the concept that probably was too expensive to even film back then, but maybe could be done today.
Well, that's an interesting story because Randy and Chris did the comic and I wrote the movie treatment, and Larry Gordon picked it up, producer in LA.
Yeah.
And we had the whole concept of the Pralien, which is a character I created, which a costume went out. Somebody got a hold of our treatment, started selling a Pralien costume, which was the Predator chest-bursted Predator. Right. And I wrote a whole treatment, and it started the whole ball rolling, and it just sort of fell off because Fox wouldn't go forward with it because it had too many producers who were involved. I mean, there was Larry and Ridley Scott and a whole number of people. So it was sort of a mess trying to put it all to Joel Silver. Anyway, it did finally get going. I was one of the producers on the project, but it spun way off of, look, in the first movie, as I pointed out, predators only go to the hottest climates. We established that, and that was picked up in the movies. In the second movie, which is interesting also because we did the comic, and we get a call from Fox one day, and they said you have to sign over a document that says that because we're basing the second movie on your comic, we need you to sign a chain of title that says that we own this and it's our story. And I said, okay, because we had big business with Fox at the time. And then we had to license then the comic to do the adaptation of the movie. So maybe the only comic book adaptation of a movie that's based on the comic by the same publisher that licensed the adaptation.
I just feel like the world missed out. Because I don't care about those other Aliens vs. Predator movies. They're forgettable, but I never will forget that comic. It was so wonderful.
Yeah. Well, they end up the problem is you have to pay attention to continuity, and sometimes the studios bring in a creative person who doesn't really adhere to the continuity, which is their choice. But we'd established that predators need hot climates, and of course, in the movie, somebody had the idea, let's put this all at the North Pole in the ice and all of that, which completely...
It doesn't really work, right?
Well, not with our...
canon.
Not with our continuity, but anyway.
Okay, well, okay. There's so many folks that I could talk to you about. I could talk to you about John Byrne, Frank Miller, Stan Sakai. Any of those legend folks were just, to me, that was some of the apex of your creator on stuff was the apex, was the legend line. But what I always come back to with Dark Horse, I come back to Dark Horse Presents #1. I come back to Concrete. I come back to it being one of the most unusual, memorable science fiction comics, because that's what it is. But it was one that I could give to my friends who had zero interest in comic books. I could give to my girlfriend. I could give to my pal who did not like superhero comics. and they could be just sucked into it because of the amazing writing and characterization and just unique concepts around Concrete. So just tell me a little bit, how did Concrete happen at Dark Horse?
Well, Paul was a member of APA 5. So, as I said, in APA 5, if you were an aspiring artist or writer, you'd submit your own section of the monthly book. They had only keep, I remember, 50 members at a time, and then we had a long waiting list of when somebody dropped out, somebody be in. There was a central mailer who sort of brought all each month's submissions and put it together in like a an amateur press publication, and then sent it out to everyone. And you'd put your story or art in, then you'd be savaged by all the other members who tell you how awful your art was and how your story sucked. So it was a good experience because it gave you a thick skin, because look, when you write something or draw something out in the marketplace, you're revealed. There's no hiding.
Or when you put a video out on YouTube, believe me, if you look at the comments sections.
Yeah. So you're out there. You are what you are, and then people have to make their decision whether you're in the right profession or not. But anyway, that Paul was one of the members who was one of the most talented. And when I decided to start this publication, I wanted to go to APA 5 members because there was a lot of talent there. And Randy, who had been a close friend of Paul's before I met Paul, he called Paul, and Paul had this submission that he was getting ready, and it was called Concrete. And he sent it to us, and we started doing the 8-page stories in Dark Horse Present. And then there was so much acclaim that we started the comic book. And, I'd still be publishing it. I would have published it every month since our beginning. But, Paul has other things to do, and and
I feel like there's some unpublished Concrete out there though that I've seen sort of on his website, and there's just unusual things. The character started moving in different directions, the publishing schedule started moving in different directions, and I really miss it.
Well, Paul will do more Concrete, and he has to get the inspiration, has to work up. Yeah. I remember calling him one time and saying, Paul, we've sort of been stuck in this place with Concrete. The whole thing is to surprise people and to move the story along. And then he says, you're right. And then Concrete has a baby, so that was shocking to me. I was surprised. Anyway,
of all those titles, I remember there were attempts at adaptations. There's even some clips out there. I think I have one.
You mean as far as getting entertainment?
And because I really feel like it could never have been done really before. Maybe a movie, but movie's not right for Concrete. Like, I feel in the age of the digital streaming series, what would be better that would appeal to? It could appeal to anyone than like the Concrete man crossing the ocean, climbing the mountain, doing the things from Concrete.
There's versions. Look, we've been through it all. I promised Paul that before we're dead, we're going to get a film or a series made.
Yeah.
We've gotten very close a few times, but we've been trying. And you're right. During the 90s, the technological challenges we couldn't overcome them budget-wise. We had people like Bill Murray wanted to play the character, and that's a lost, that's a lost opportunity. We have some well-known people now that we're talking to, and we'll see what happens. There's one actor who would really be appropriate and add additional meaning to the role, but we'll see where we go. I don't give up.
You mean The Rock, right? It would be perfect.
No, I don't mean The Rock.
It would be a perfect fit.
Nice try, but no. The Rock. If The Rock's in your movie, you want him on camera all the time. You don't want him voicing something.
Yeah, that might be true.
Yeah.
Oh, wait a minute. How about it could be Ron Lithgow? That would be the only one that I would.
Yeah, Ron Lithgow doesn't look like The Rock.
Yeah, right. Let me play something real quick. This is short. You've probably seen it. Maybe you have. So this was somebody's attempt.
Yeah, I've seen it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it
And
was a special effects house was doing what they could do, and we have a number of little clips like that of people who have tried to tackle it. Once again, we always run into budget, and
yeah,
I
it
have a couple.
demands the big, it's ironic because it seems like it wouldn't be as big budget, but just the scope of his adventures plus his
Well, the thing is that you
odd.
could use in the. There was a time when you'd have to do it CG, and CG was really expensive. It's not that it's cheap now, but now the practical effects are so amazing that you could do a lot of it with practical suit. I mean, if you saw Guillermo's the movie we did, Hellboy
Hmm.
and the Golden Army, those characters were practical. They People think that those are all CG. Who aren't paying attention, they've told me, well, how much was CG? Well, no, they were guys in suits, and the suits are so amazing now. You could do a lot of it with that, which would cut the cost dramatically. So, look, one way or another, we're going to get it done. I don't know how we're going to do it, but we're going to do it. And
I
somebody,
know it will be a huge success if it's done just with just the right amount of budget and just stick to those comics because they were so great.
they're great. You don't have to reinvent them. That's one of my I shouldn't say complaints, but one of the things that bothers me is that people get excited about something and then we start changing it.
Yeah.
In the
Yes.
course of development. But look, film and series have different needs than comics, and so there's always going to be some some change.
Sure. But I felt like man, those short stories, the Dark Horse Presents short stories, were the ideal way. Like, not start with an origin story. Thank God you didn't start with an origin
No,
story.
no, geez, origin story came what, 10, 12 years later?
Yeah, and then they even redid it and kind of retro did the origin, but it was like it was that mystery of like, who is this guy in these very mundane-ish situations?
Just like in real life, right?
Backstory.
Just like in real life. That's always been one of my own ideas, is that you don't have to explain everything every time. Sometimes we never find out the answer. You know,
I would not want to
who
know.
is D.B. Cooper? We'll never know.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to know until maybe the end of the series when he reveals it to his friends in a flashback sort of scenario. I think that would be, it would just be an amazing like moment of that you don't get in TV very much anymore.
Look, J.J. Abrams has a great what are the talks? What do they call that?
The TED Talks.
TED Talks. He has a great TED Talk that I've shown my editors in the past about the mystery box and how the mystery box supports story and keeps people watching and intrigued by the story. They're looking for answers, and I used to say that, and nowhere near the same with the same articulation. He said it in such a perfect way at that presentation. So I think anyone who wants to understand story should watch that. It's a brilliant explanation of what drives story, the mystery box.
You brought up Hellboy, and I can't believe I neglected to mention Mike Mignola because of all those Legends creators. He's, I think, the guy that stuck around the longest. And
Mike is the guy that epitomizes what I was talking about as far as a creator, and what a creator could do if he owns his own work. I mean, I go to conventions sometimes, and I will come up to artists and I'd say that I'm looking for, and I'll say, I'd like to know if you'd work for Dark Horse, and you'd be surprised how many times they'll say, why would I do that? I'm working on Spider-Man.
Yeah.
Why would I do that? I'm doing Batman. And I would say, well, let me ask you a question. Just curious, who did Batman 10 years ago? I don't know. Who did Spider-Man 10 years ago? I don't know. Why are you asking me this? Just go along with me. Who did Superman 10 years ago? I don't know. I said, who did Frank Miller? Who did Sin City 10 years ago? Oh, that was Frank Miller. Who did Hellboy 10 years ago? Oh, that was Mike Mignola. and then the light goes on. You can, if you have passion as a creator for these, that's great, but you're not going to be remembered for Superman or Batman. Or think of the great artists that have worked on some of these books, and it's whoever's working on it now.
With rare exceptions, I think. Yeah,
very rare exceptions. Yeah.
And
but everyone knows who did even Concrete. People know who did.
And even those folks like, say, like a John Byrne, who has a pretty big rep, right, in the mainstream industry. Well, he did Next Men for you guys, and some other stuff too. That was, I rank among my very favorite work of his, because it just came directly from him.
Right. No, that was John. Unfortunately, in that book, John put me as an evil alien villain, and he was supposed to save me. That's Chris, not John, but that you're showing right now.
Oh, that's Chris?
That's Chris. Oh, is that? No, that's John. Boy, John looks like Chris.
Okay, yeah. You scared me for a second.
Oh, geez, that scares me.
They flip-flopped over.
John looks a little bit like Chris right now. So anyway.
Well, I agree. I just think he's one of my all-time favorite mainstream creators, and one of those guys who walked both of sides of the line and said, like, look, I'll keep putting out mainstream stuff for a paycheck, and I'll put out my own stuff and make it exactly how I want.
Well, John, look, John does what he wants to do. He achieved that level of success that he's in control of his own life. I would like to see John do more creator-owned work, but he lived. That's the whole point of creator rights, that they can choose what they want to do and go where they want to go.
Ironically, John is choosing to draw and write comics on, like, he didn't produce this cover because he wouldn't have used the logos.
Right.
But he's like, this is what he wants. He wants to tell that story that he felt he got robbed from. He's like, why not? Right. I'm just going to do it.
Sure. Absolutely. He should.
I think it's great.
And that's the beauty of creator rights. Basically, the X-Men that he did with Chris, they created those X-Men. Those are not the same X-Men as Jack created way back when.
Not at all.
They used his X-Men platform and really put new energy and new story direction using most of the same characters. They created a whole cast of new characters back then.
So rather than go through every one of them, because there's so many and we're kind of running low on time, I know you got to get out of here. Let's just talk about just Legend in general, that imprint, how it came to be and what it meant to you, because I think it's a high water of all of the Dark Horse books that I remember. Most of my favorites are in the Legends imprint.
Terrific creators. I mean, Jeff Darrow, amazing artist. Of course, Frank Miller, who's a legend. Mike Mignola, Mike Allred, who created Mad Men. Paul Chadwick, of course. I mean, it's a who's who. And, when we used to have dinners in different conventions in the United States and Hawaii and Australia and the UK, we'd always have a big dinner with all the creators. And we used to always say, if a meteor hits this building, half the industry is wiped out, in those days, because there was a lot of camaraderie in those days. There were 19 distributors. There was IAD, which was a distribution arm, and they're all the conventions. So we'd see each other week after week after week throughout the year. So you got to know all these people really well, and you were around them quite a bit. And then we started having our own conventions. We had a Dark Horse convention in Portland for a number of years that was very successful, but it ended up taking up too much time. I was soaking up there a lot of work to do right, and it just became too much work. So we stopped doing it. But in the course of all these people interacting, the discussion of creating their own label came up. And some great books were the result of that. But I got to say, you get a lot of creators like that, and they all have their own ideas of what should be done. And it just, at some point, they decided we're better off. If we want to team up individually, we can do that. we don't have to have a label to do that. We can continue to do our books without the label. We can continue to work together without the label. And they just sort of at some point decided that, because when you have a group and you have a label, you have to decide, somebody has to take charge and decide how we're going to proceed. What are the rules? What are we going to do here? Is it a shared universe? Is it not? And it just, I think it just became too much of a burden to try and figure all those things out. So ultimately,
who we forgot too, in some of the Legends creators, we got a Jeff Darrow.
Oh, Jeff Darrow. I said Jeff Darrow right off front, but Art Adams is who I forgot to put in there. I mean, it was an amazing group of people, of comics creators, and very proud of it when we did it. I think it inspired a lot of other people. You know, I got to say about Frank. So I talked about Paul Chadwick being a key moment in Dark Horse, because he was getting big offers to leave. And I know he said in, I don't know if it was Time or Newsweek, they asked him what it would take to leave Dark Horse. And Paul said Mike Richardson going down in an airplane crash. Well, he's been very loyal to the company from day one. And he was he could have done other things, but he stayed with Dark Horse and has stayed all these years. So I have to say that. The second big moment was I had met Jeff Darrow, and he told me that, and we got to be friends, and he told me that he was working on a book with Frank Miller. And I said, well, give us a chance. Just give us a chance. Let us sit down and talk to Frank when he's ready to make his decision. So Jeff said he would. And I don't know, maybe a year passed, and I had almost forgot about it. But I get a call from Jeff one day, and he says, go to this address in Los Angeles, be there. Can you be there tomorrow at noon? And Frank will be there and talk to you. So I had our accounting build up this model that showed where every penny of a comic went in the production, in the distribution, in the marketing, all of it. It had and how much was made at every level. And it was a stack of papers. And I remember Randy and I were sitting in a restaurant off Traction Avenue where Frank used to frequent. And he came in and he pulled out a pencil and a paper and set it on the thing. And he says, okay, Jeff wanted me to meet with you. So we talked for a minute. And I said, okay, here. And I handed him this wad of paper, and he started looking through it. And he said, I'll be here tomorrow. I'll meet you tomorrow. So it was sort of a short meeting, and he left. Well, I found out later he went and called Dave Gibbons and told him, I just met this publisher who gave us the keys to the kingdom. Awesome. Because evidently he had never gotten more than a few lines on a statement. So he came back the next day, and we shook hands, and I offered him 90% of the profits to get him. Once again, Frank said, no, it has to be fair. And he said, here's the deal that we're doing. Yeah.
He wanted less?
He took less than I offered. That's right. Because he said it has to be fair. And it's smart, because
it is smart.
We would have had 10%. We have a lot of uncharged costs, and we wouldn't have made any money. And he realized that. Right. But I was willing at the time, of course, to do anything to get Frank Miller to come.
And in hindsight, who else could have published that? Like, who would have or could have? It could have only been maybe, it would have been like an art house, like Fantagraphics or something.
Yeah, I don't know who would have done it, but so people ask me about censorship. My decision on censorship is made when I decide to work with the artist or the creator. So once I decide, they're going to do what they're going to do. And there's only one creator in history that I said I would not publish what they sent me. H.R. Giger, I wanted him to do a book for us. And his agent, Leslie Berenice, said, but you'll never publish it. And I said, I will publish it. I'm telling you what I do. By my choice of having him do what he wants to do, I will publish it. And I got the first couple pages, and I called Leslie and I said, Leslie, I can't publish this. And he says, I told you. And I said, for once, somebody was right. I can't publish this. I won't tell you what was going on, but
because of the content
because issue. Of the content. Look, we've published a lot of content. This one was way over shocked me with what and you can think of H.R. Giger's mind, so you can if you know much about him, he's a creative genius. He was actually very happy with Dark Horse, but because we always in our comics gave him credit for designing the aliens, that
Yeah,
he said
right.
he never got that credit elsewhere.
So I have an interesting one that's occurred to me a long time ago, about Frank Miller and a book you didn't publish from him, and I'm wondering if you had the opportunity and didn't. And I'm talking about Holy Terror, because when that came out, I have the hardcover, first printing hardcover. I mean, it looks and feels exactly like a Dark Horse book.
Yeah.
It feels like 300.
Yeah, I think how that came about was Bob Schreck had worked with us at that time, and Bob went to DC. And I think Frank was looking to do something with Bob, so he took it over there. And then years later, Bob was at Legendary, and that's where they printed it.
Yeah.
Legendary.
I don't think you missed too. It's an interesting work. I'll give it that. Graphically, it's a tour de force. Subject matter was, controversial and a little confusing to me when I read it.
Well, it came when he wrote that, it came in the heat of 9/11.
Yeah.
A lot of people were angry at that time, and that was I can't speak for Frank, but I think that was his reaction to it, that he was angry. And so the book didn't finally come out till 10 years later.
Yeah.
And sort of missed its moment, but Frank had done it, and it was, it deserved to be seen. People can think what they want, but
I agree. We did a whole special on it. We talked about it. I said, Frank's got enough credit in the bank. He can write whatever he wants. And I'm going to come check it out.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm not advocate of the censoring that's going on these days with thought and content. It's disturbing. When
agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed.
So we fought it, but I'll say we fought against censorship our whole entire existence. I mean, I've written articles about our First Amendment rights, for Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, and the rights of comics creators to have the same freedom of speech that those in film and other forms of print have. And somehow the irony is that many people still think of comics as a kid's medium, and the kids have been left behind a long time ago.
Totally.
The average reader, it's been a few years, but the average reader of comics was between 25 and 30 when one of the studies was done. It's not the kid riding his bike around like when I was a kid.
Absolutely not. And so those kind of perfect, teeing me up for the perfect segue, by the way, for our last thing that I want to cover here, because it was announced very recently. And by the way, I apologize to anyone out there for any Dark Horse comics or creators I'm giving the short shrift to. I love them so much all the way. And I'm a little less familiar with some of the more current stuff. Like that was my era in the comic shop, right? But so this year it was announced that the Embracer Group, is purchased Dark Horse Comics, and now it's going to become part of their conglomerate that owns video game companies. I think other media producing outlets. Well, you want to tell us a little bit about how this came to be?
Sure. I think that a few years ago we made a deal with a well-meaning company in China. I think that world events they weren't financially able to survive. And so through a transfer of stock, Embracer came on board. Basically, that stock was put up for sale, and we had quite a few people or companies interested. One of the conditions was that I continued to stay, and so that gave me a good opportunity to help find the right company for Dark Horse. And CEO of Embracer. I've talked to him many times. We talk pretty regularly, and he started out in comics, believe it or not, at a very young age, doing a comic book mail order service, and he has no interest. He had no interest in running Dark Horse. Dark Horse is a weird combination of my interests. That's how it built up. So the areas that we've gone into, I mean, as you can see, the reason we got into product is because.
And let me do that again. I'm going to solo you. Hang on, do that one more time.
Okay, you want to see it?
Wow.
So I'll just.
I see the Paul Levitt's book back there too. Lovely, lovely.
So, oh, you saw Paul Levitt's? Good. I mean, I have Steve Rude just sent me a Superman painting, and awesome. It's great. It's the stuff that I like. So we built this company, and trying to pull this up, see if I can show you something, but I'm not sure if I can find it here.
Well, because we've had, man, decade after decade of Dark Horse. I'm really glad to hear that you're going to still be at the helm. Any plans to retire, get out of the biz?
Oh, no. Why would I retire?
Yeah, why would you?
Anyway, the CEO, Lars Wingefors, I hope I pronounce his last name. We've had lots of talk with Lars. They don't really have an entertainment division like us, and they basically focus on video game companies.
Yeah,
their group. So there's a whole new division that I'm in charge of, and we'll be looking for, I hate using cliched words, but synergies.
Yeah.
Between Dark Horse and a whole slew of game companies that we're very excited about. So we'll be creating worlds in print form for some of these people, and some of these game companies. We're hoping to move some of our favorite characters into video games. I tried to start my own video game company 15 years ago, but companies like EA kept doubling salaries and stealing our people. So I got out of that. But we work with a lot of the top game companies doing art books and story. Yeah. We build worlds around these things. We've done it very early on with things like Halo, but Witcher is one of our favorites right now. Critical Role we're building out with them. Any number of things that we help build the world, and we're eager to start moving with some of these game companies because there's some amazing IP concepts in these video games. So it's wide open. And then, of course, we want to take some of the video game material IPs and translate them into series and film. So it's a great space for us. Lars is a big supporter. He knew about Dark Horse before he ever did the deal. It was great for me. As I told Lars, I'm not a very good employee. I'm a great CEO, though. So he and I talk, and I still run the company, and that's good. It's unfortunate that the way things came down for the people in China, but we had no say in that. That was outside our control.
So
anyway, we're working at home now, and one of the surprises that I have to point out with Dark Horse is we are now and I never give numbers, but you hear about who's the third largest. We're the third largest. We're a 9-figure company, and we never give those numbers. I see people saying, "Oh, that they do this amount or that." No, we do way beyond that, and we've actually over the last 3 years doubled our gross income. It's been amazing. People working from home. I have to say we have the greatest staff that we've ever had. We have really committed people who are doing a great job, and over the years, I get a lot of the credit, but we have great people all through the company. It's just a terrific team, and it takes a long time to build that to the extent that we have.
Well, Mike, you built an incredible thing over there, and there's one humongous bit that I forgot. I just want to bring it up. I don't want to belabor this too long, but come on. Like manga, like who was the first? Not maybe not the first, but one of the first. And you picked the best licenses with Lone Wolf and Cub, and like you skimmed the cream of the cream of the cream, of manga. And at that time, it's just come to explode and dominate the comics publishing industry to a large degree. So talk about manga for a second.
I had an interest in it. I had the action comics, Japanese action comics that had Lone Wolf and Cub, and became a very good friend of Koike all the way up till his death. Used to go golfing with him over in Japan, and it's interesting because he made his own golf clubs and then used them and then sold them. But he literally manufactured with a golf club maker, and he, I don't know that he ever gave me the a clear answer, but his interest in how swords were made, I always sort of saw a connection with how he had his golf clubs made.
Oh, of course,
something in his head. Yeah. Well, I asked him, he would just smile and never give me a real answer. But of course, I did 47 Ronin at his encouragement. It was a story that I was fascinated with. So, and we did the legend. I looked at all the movies and the historical part and made my version of it, and which is everyone's made their version of the story. But I like.
Oh, you're talking about Lone Wolf and Cub at this point.
No, I'm talking 47 Ronin.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure.
I did that at. Why would it? The whole cultural appropriation thing when I did it was a little bit nerve making, but I love the story. And look, I'm a member of the human race, and this is an inspiring story about honor. And so Koike urged me to do this story. And Koike was a genius in his own right. He got behind and had contacts in the government in Japan and so on. And he was one of the proponents of, Japan's a small island and doesn't have many resources. Koike's push was, but we can create IP, and our IP can go all over the world. And that's what happened. He was one of the early proponents of that. And the whole comic book.
See that though? Did you really think like these are such great comics that they have to do well in this country?
What I thought was I keep saying it. I like these things. I know somebody else will like these things. So there's two ways that I got that I was able to get, as you say, the cream of the manga. One was to stand. I flew regularly to Japan, went to the big bookstores, and I stood in there and I'd spend the day going down the rack, looking at every book and picking the ones that appealed to me. So couldn't read the Japanese, but I could look at them, and if I could tell the story generally and or understand it and like the look and the feel, then I put that on the list. And the second thing, after a while, we brought on Studio Produce. That was Torrin Smith, who I would tell him the books that I wanted to go after, and he would pitch books at me. And Torrin would go and find them and make deals with them. But one of the books that is our biggest hit right now, Berserk, I went over to the publisher. We hadn't worked with them before, and I sat in their library and went for hours and went through with I don't know how many titles I went through, but I picked two. After going through, one was Berserk out of all their books. The other was Fruits Basket. And so we went to them and said, we want these two. Unfortunately, they gave Fruits Basket to somebody else.
Yeah, Viz or Tokyo Pop or something got that.
Yeah, Tokyo Pop, I believe. But anyway, that was the more immediate hit. But in the long run, Berserk turned out to be the much larger hit. Right now, I'm telling you, we can't print it fast enough. It is huge. It's blown up unbelievably. And, it's a great series that's really, if you read it, not like any other series. It was.
Do you draw a distinction between manga and American comics, or is it just like good comics is good comics?
Yeah, I mean, good comics is good comics. I mean, we've done deals with all across the board, different types of comic makers, comic creators. We've done deals with groups over there. We've gone from Jessica to to Koike. I mean, there's broad range of things. But I remember seeing Astro Boy and didn't know it was Japanese at the time. I didn't even know it was Japanese. It had the theme song at the beginning, but something so odd about it. Right away there's something different about that. But of course, at the time, I didn't understand it was because it was repurposed over for American market. But I was attracted to just what it was. So I found as I was in art school, particularly, that I was attracted to the Japanese approach to art, the whole sensibility behind Japanese art. And then you dig in and you find out about Bushido Code and those types of things. Koike drew a parallel between the American West and the code of the gunfighter and the feudal Japanese samurai and their code, Bushido Code. I mean, he saw a direct parallel between those two things.
Sure. Okay, now my last, because I'm going to finish up this interview here, but I'm still stuck on manga a little bit here because I go,
one of the things I'll say, one more, you're asking about, something has to be said, is that I went to Japan and I met with the creators the same way I did there. I didn't want to go through the companies, and that caused some issues. I was warned once by one of the companies, don't talk directly to our creator, because it hadn't really been done before. And I actually, some of the creators I met at midnight in the backs of hotel.
That's great.
Serious.
That's great.
I can tell you one creator, he was so worried he was being followed. We started at one hotel, went through two more hotels, and then went to the back room of a fourth hotel. So
so what do you think it is? I don't even know if you can answer this question. Everybody wants to know this. Why is manga? Why do Japanese comics dominate the American comics charts?
Well, I think there's definitely, you can trace it back. First of all, comics, the legend, I don't know if it's true or not, the legend of why comics became so big in Japan in the first place, because comics really are an American invention.
Yeah.
Even though Will Eisner always pointed out, created by European immigrants.
True.
So he'd always correct me, because I always say it's one of the few original American art forms, and he'd say created by European immigrants. But one of the legends why it became so big is that after World War II, all of the media was shut down in Japan. The theaters were closed. There wasn't much entertainment, but the GIs were over there and had a lot of comic books, and they left them behind, and the kids would pick them up and they'd look at them. So as they grew older, it became something that different artists and different writers became inspired by, to do their own versions of these.
And they had a wide variety of subject matter, like from the get-go, that they were exploring.
Well, you always heard, when I was getting ready to go over there and you heard it, that you could get on the subway and see 60-year-old grandmas reading manga, Japanese comic. Well, when I went there the first time, guess what? I got on that subway and I saw businessmen and all kinds of people looking at comics. It was true.
I think that's great. That's the vision that I want for American comics. I think we've gotten to like the literati, but we haven't like hit the working man, the working class adult quite.
Yeah, I always thought the term comics lit was sort of exclusionary.
Yeah.
All of the comics that'll never be called comics lit, and some of the comics that were, I always thought it was by critics who really didn't want to review comics, so needed to come up with something that gave them more importance. Comics lit, but they're all comic books. Graphic novels are comic books. That's the term. People ask me why is it called a comic book? It's not funny. And I'd say because it's from the comic strips. It's from the funny pages. That term's not even used anymore.
Sure.
Yeah, but anyway, you asked about why manga has become so big, and I will tell you, I believe there's a direct relationship between the anime that was being shown on kids television back in the 90s, because you watch the growth. It's as that generation grew. And I heard one day somebody told me they went to, and as a fan of manga and as somebody who was in it early on here in the States, somebody told me that they went to the Borders store and there were a dozen girls sitting down reading manga. And it's a particular style of manga that's aimed at young girls. And as you know, in the direct sales market, estimates were 90% of the customers were male or more at that time, And so I went out there to take a look because that made me curious. And guess what? Here's all these girls sitting there reading these things. True. And it was sort of an eye opener of where the market was going. I think that's what's led into manga and anime, I believe, is what's widened the market and even right. That numbers between men and women.
I think they automatically aim for a superset of the audience that traditional American comics aims for, right? And they got it, and it turns out that's an exponentially larger market right. than the insular direct market comic fan.
Well, if we would have stayed with traditional Marvel and DC fare of the 80s and at least the early 90s, I don't know we would have seen that inclusion of women into the market. But I think, again, I believe that anime and manga is what brought women in. And once they get beyond that point, they're embracing other kinds of comics. And not only that, there weren't many female creators back when I started Dark Horse, very few. And I think that anime and anime and manga experience brought a lot of creators in. You can see it in the influence of the comics. Comics have a lot of cartoonists now as opposed to illustrators, and there is a difference. And there's much fewer. It's far fewer illustrators in the business now, and far more cartoonists. Not one better than the other.
Yeah, but like textural rendering and stuff has moved into the coloring side as opposed
right.
to the inking side, right? So it's a shifting even in the abilities and the influences of the current artists.
Right.
I think it's amazing.
That's right. And I just think you can see the influence of manga in a lot of mainstream comics now. And
I just think its overall cultural influence in this country and all over the world, I think is undeniable. And I think you were one of, if not the first, maybe not the first American publisher, but
wasn't the first. I think the manga in his line, I know. And there is some other smatterings, but I think we may have been the first to really build a whole line of manga inside our publishing line, or at least one of the first. I always have to be careful saying the first because you get into trouble.
You don't have to be the first, Mike, because you're the best. You pick the best titles. It's that editorial eye. It's that commitment to creator rights. That's the success of and what's evident from anybody who watched this interview. Man, you really love this stuff. You read it and you love it.
I live it.
Seriously.
I live it. So look, there's my boxes right there that's the ones I'm reading right now.
I love it. It looks so much like my room. This is ridiculous, Mike. But mine's
I have my book rooms downstairs.
Mine's the budget version, I think.
Mike, I hate to say it, but I've got a warehouse full of these toys. So
that's great.
You acquire stuff as you go through the years.
Sure. Well, I really want to thank you, Mike, for your time here today. Incredible conversation. And I'm just going to stress again how important you are to the industry, to the medium, to the art form of comics, to the business of comics, like all of those pieces. You're a key player, and we really appreciate you for that.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I got to get out of here. I got to go make some business, play the closing credits. Anything you want to say to the folks before you get out of here?
No, just may the horse be with you.
Oh, man, we forgot about the manga influence on the Mandalorian, too. The Mangalorian, as I like to call it. Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. Everything that you have done, do, and will do for the industry. Thanks again.
Well, thank you.
Holy cow, folks. Mike Richardson. We had a nice group of people watching that entire thing. It grew and grew. Still got 20 people watching live. That's pretty good for this show. I want to thank you all for watching. Before I get out of here, we're going to play the credits. We're going to play the closing cameo credit. I'll probably play something we've seen before. But I also want to encourage you, if you've got comics that you want to see on this show, there's one place to send them, the $1 Million Mailbox, P.O. Box 1163, Arcata, California, 95518. Send those comics here. We'll spread them out on the $1 Million Comics Cam, take a look at them, give you the God's honest truth. I can't do for you what a Mike Richardson could do for you, but I can at least give you some unvarnished opinion on your work. So please consider doing that. Oh, man. Okay, next week, it might be my last interview, at least for a while. So I'm not ending this show, but I am changing the format a bit. I've had a lot of great interviews, and I've had some not great interviews, okay? This has been a learning and a growing experience for me. I had some experiences recently. One of my interviewees has expressed some dismay and doesn't want to come back to the show. A couple of them have, for things that I might have brought up on the air or talked about uncomfortable subjects that I probably should have steered away from. I just profusely apologize to anybody who feels that way. Part of my mission here is to tell the truth and just talk about what I like to talk about. So I really don't like the feeling that I got that somebody doesn't trust me to come back on the show again. But I can only do what I can do. I can only promise to tell the truth and be myself. So next week, I don't have a thumbnail for this yet. Next week, Craig Yo, publisher of the Yo Books imprint, he's going to be promoting his latest book that he's been working on. We'll talk about all his stuff. We'll talk about his rich history working with the Muppets, working with IDW, making great comics of all kinds. And that's going to be a lot of fun. So come back for that. Now I'm going to play the credits and play our cameo and get out of here. And we will see you next time. See ya.
Hey, this is Rob Liefeld, Deadpool, Cable, Domino, X-Force, New Mutants, Image Comics, all of it. What is up? Coming to you live here from my beautiful home office to tell you all that there is a YouTube show that you absolutely have to check out, the Comic Book News. Comic Book News with Dan Shaheen. Dan Shaheen. He's got your comic book news for you. The latest, the greatest, the bestest of the restest with Dan Shaheen on the Comic Book News. Go to YouTube, search Comic Book News. There's probably going to be a link with this. Hit that. Check it out. You love comics. I love comics. I love nothing more than to hear news about comics and upcoming comics. And Dan's your man. He's got your news. Comic Book News. Dan Shaheen. Check it out. Rob Liefeld out.